80 years ago, Japan was at war with America and other countries. Countless people, Japanese, Americans, and others caught up in the fighting, were wounded or lost their lives. As the war was drawing to a close, the United States dropped a single atomic bomb on Nagasaki. At the time, I was 3 years old. My name is Hideko Matsuya, and I was living in Nagasaki. You may have seen photos or drawings of the mushroom cloud that rises after an atomic bomb explodes. I was beneath that cloud. I suffered a deep head wound and lost the use of the right side of my body. Even today, I cannot lift heavy objects with my right hand or walk quickly. Every summer, as the heat builds, the scar on my head begins to throb with pain. Again and again, I have asked myself, what if I had never been exposed to the bomb? The atomic bomb took tens of thousands of lives in an instant, but it also robbed the health of those who survived, leaving lasting scars and years of suffering. Some wounds are visible. Others, the wounds in the heart, cannot be seen. We survivors do not want this suffering to be forgotten or treated as if it never happened. In school, at work, in marriage, we faced hardships, tried to overcome them, and struggled to build our lives. And we continue to ask, how can we ensure that no one else will ever face this kind of suffering again? Today, I will share with you the story of the 80 years I have lived since that day. I hope you will listen and think about it together with me. August 1945. I lived with my father and mother in Nasa, Nagasaki. I had grown up strong and healthy. So healthy, in fact, that I never even caught a cold. People said I was a lively, energetic child. By then, nearly 4 years have passed since the war with the United States began. In Japan, food like rice and sugar, as well as clothing and other daily necessities, were all in short supply. Because of this, families received only a fixed amount of goods under a system called rationing. On the morning of August 9th, my mother went out to collect our ration of miso. My father, since he had a day of work, stayed home and cooked lunch for me. I sat near the window, watching the chickens in our yard. And then, the clock reached 11:02 a.m. Flash. An American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. It exploded in the sky about 500 meters above the ground. Our house was about 2.5 kilometers away from the hypocenter. The force of the blast tore through our home. The tatami mat flipped up, and the roof shifted off balance. My father, who had been in the kitchen, rushed to me. He found me collapsed, unconscious, blood streaming from my head. A roof tile, blown loose by the blast, had struck the back left side of my head. My father carried me in his arms while I was still unconscious, and together with my mother, who had survived unharmed, he rushed me to a first aid station. They wanted me to receive treatment for the wound on my head. The place was already crowded with injured. When the doctor saw my wound, he looked shocked and said, "It's already too late." A roof tile, hurled by the blast, had struck me so hard that the back of my head was dented nearly 5 centimeters deep. I was unable to receive proper treatment and remained unconscious. On the way home, still being carried, my body suddenly convulsed at times. Eventually, I regained consciousness. But because of the injury to my head, my right hand and right leg never moved again. 6 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the war with the United States and its allies came to an end. 2 months later, our family moved temporarily to the Koto Islands, where we had relatives we could rely on. I was bedridden at the time, and soon I began to suffer from symptoms such as hair loss and persistent diarrhea, the effects of radiation from the bomb. The wound on my head kept discharging pus, and it took more than 2 years before it finally closed. But even once it healed, the paralysis on the right side of my body remained. In Goto, I received treatment and practiced walking. Little by little, I managed to walk again, though only slowly. In the spring of 1949, after we returned to Nagasaki, I entered elementary school, 1 year behind children my own age. I still dragged my right foot, and even the walk to school was a struggle. The road to school included more than 100 steps. Most days I walked hand in hand with my older sister. On rainy days, my mother would carry me on her back up the long stairs. I was only 3 years old when I was exposed to the atomic bomb, so I have no memory of it myself. Before I started elementary school, my mother told me that the paralysis on the right side of my body was because of the atomic bomb. In the early years of elementary school, I played with my friends and even joined in physical education classes. But by the time I reached 3rd grade, I began sitting out more and more often. Deep down, I felt ashamed of my disability. What wounded me most was the bullying from classmates. When I walked, boys would trail behind me, mocking me by imitating the way I dragged my foot. They also taunted me with words, and it cut deeply. When I came home in tears, my mother immediately noticed. "Something happened at school, didn't it?" she asked. I burst out, "Mother, why do I have to be bullied like this, just because I was exposed to the atomic bomb?" The very next day, my mother came to my classroom before lessons began. She stood in front of the children who bullied me and said, "This child is disabled because of the atomic bomb. Don't bully her." And as long as the bullying continued, she came back again and again, insisting that my classmates stop. When I entered junior high school, my mother told me that I had been adopted when I was just 1 year old. Before the bombing, I was perfectly healthy. I never even caught a cold. But the atomic bomb robbed me of my health, leaving me with paralysis on the right side of my body and other lasting effects. My mother once said to me, "If you hadn't come to us as an adopted child, you would never have been exposed to the bomb and you would never have been injured." She carried a heavy sense of guilt for having taken me in. But I told her firmly, "It's not your fault, not at all." I was deeply grateful to my parents for raising me with such love. So then, whose fault was it that my body became disabled? As a junior high school student, I began to feel anger toward those in power, the leaders who had started the war and those who decided to use the atomic bomb. They left scars on my body that can never heal, and they left scars on the hurts of my family as well. After the war, whenever I saw airplanes in the sky, Even though I knew they were not the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, the very sight of a plane was enough to stir my anger and make my chest tighten with pain. When I was in my first year of junior high school, I began to study the abacus. At the time, I dreamed of becoming an office worker who would handle company accounting. I once even dreamed of becoming a volleyball player. I loved sport, but with my disability, I knew that was impossible. In high school, I entered the commercial course and improved even more at the abacus. But then I hit a wall in the abacus proficiency test. From level 3 and above, examinees had to master a skill called sleep calculation. Those with two good hands could flip through stacks of forms with one hand while working the abacus with the other. For me, with my right hand disabled, it was nearly impossible. I failed the test many times. Again and again I thought, if only I had not been exposed to the atomic bomb. My resentment toward it grew stronger. Every time I failed the abacus test, my mother encouraged me. Don't worry, you can try again next time. But one day, I happened to see her in the kitchen, crying quietly to herself. She carried the regret that if she had never taken me in as her adopted child, she would never have had to endure such hardships. I could not bear to see my mother blame herself any longer. I told myself, I don't want to use my weak hand or my weak leg as an excuse for what I cannot do. From then on, I worked to increase what I could do on my own, for her sake as much as for myself. For example, I taught myself to peel apples and cut my nails almost entirely with my left hand. I failed the level 2 abacus test 6 times, but on the 7th attempt, I finally passed. At last, I've overcome it. Passing the test meant more than just mastering the abacus. It meant facing the wounds left by the atomic bomb and overcoming them. More than anything, what filled me with joy was seeing the happiness on my mother's face. After graduating from high school, I began working for the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Survivors Council, known in Japanese as Nagasaki Shisaikyo. It was an organization where survivors like myself came together to seek relief and support for Hibakusha and to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons. At the time, the council also ran a small Hibakusha shop selling souvenirs and other goods. I worked there as a clerk. All of my coworkers were survivors too. We carried similar pain and we understood each other deeply. Although my body was disabled by the bomb, I could rely on my colleagues with confidence. And I, in turn, was able to make a contribution, using my skill with numbers to support the work of the group. The group that eventually became the foundation of Nagasaki Shisaikyo was the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Young Maidens Association, formed 11 years after the bombing. It remains the oldest survivors organization in Nagasaki today. The group was created by people who had been teenagers or in their 20s at the time of the bombing. I joined as a teenager myself. Among us were those scarred in body and those suffering from poverty or discrimination. We supported one another as we tried to live our lives. From the days when there was no government support of any kind, survivors stood together calling out, both in Japan and abroad, for the relief of Hibakusha and for the abolition of nuclear weapons and war. At the same time, there were people in society who spoke to me with cruelty. Once, a man I dealt with at work said to me, "Just from looking at you from behind, I can tell it's you." Because of my disability, my right heel and big toe never touched the ground. My way of walking was different from most people's. I felt as though he was mocking me for it, and it cut deeply. Why should I have to hear such things from others? Again and again, I thought, if only I had not been exposed to the atomic bomb. The pain I first felt from bullying in elementary school continued to follow me into adulthood. Even after I began working at Nagasaki Shimbun, the effects of the bomb continued. Because of the paralysis on my right side, the right half of my body was thinner than the left. My body was uneven and had to order custom-made clothes and shoes. At work, I sometimes lost consciousness without warning. At the age of 35, I applied to the government for recognition of what is called atomic bomb disease, Hibakusha. Under this system, if the connection between a survivor's disability and the radiation from the bomb is recognized, and if medical treatment is deemed necessary, the person is granted financial support in the form of a special medical allowance. But my application was denied. 10 years later, at age 45, I applied again, only to be denied once more. I could only feel bitter frustration. This wound, this suffering, it all comes from the atomic bomb. There was nothing left but to take my case to court. At the age of 46, I filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government, seeking to overturn its rejection of my application for recognition of atomic bomb disease. All I wanted was this, a ruling that would make me glad to be alive. To help the judges understand the effects of my injuries, I even removed my shoes and walked before them in the courtroom. Many survivors, lawyers, and doctors stood by my side, and soon voices of support were reaching me from across Japan. Many friends stood by me, but one of the most unforgettable was Miss Chieko Watanabe, a fellow survivor who traveled widely to give testimony both in Japan and abroad. Like me, she had been 2.5 kilometers from the hypocenter. The bomb left her paralyzed from the waist down, and she lived her life in a wheelchair. At the time of my trial, Miss Watanabe was hospitalized with a heart condition. Yet for my sake, she testified from her hospital bed. Before the judges, she uncovered the scar on her left thigh to show them, a stark reminder of the horrors caused by the atomic bomb. By then, nearly 50 years had passed since the bombing, but Ms. Watanabe told the judges, "The tragedy of 47 years ago still lives on today, in the survivors themselves and in their families. Please understand this fully." Just 3 months later, Ms. Watanabe passed away in the hospital. The lawsuit, known in the press as the Matsuya case after my name, won successive victories against the government at the Nagasaki District Court and the Fukuoka High Court. Finally, in July 2000, 12 years after the case began, the Supreme Court acknowledged that I had atomic bomb disease and my win was confirmed. At last, my injury was officially recognized as the result of the atomic bomb. But my mother, who had stayed by my side and cared for me all those years, passed away before she could ever see that victory. What do you imagine when you think of the damage caused by the atomic bomb? One bomb destroyed an entire city in an instant, killing tens of thousands of people. Those exposed to the heat rays suffered terrible burns, and even if they survived, many were left with keloid scars. That, of course, is part of the atomic bomb's damage. But I want you also to understand this. Even those of us without keloids were deeply scarred in body and sprayed by the bomb, and those wounds have lasted a lifetime. From that day on, my life was changed forever. The bomb robbed me of the freedom of my body. Throughout my life, I faced countless things I could not do. But I worked hard to overcome them, because I did not want the bomb to defeat me. One of my triumphs was passing the level 2 abacus test after many failed attempts. Yet there were also things I could never do. For example, I longed to wear high heels, but I never could. When I graduated from school and began working, I dreamed of walking through the city in bright red high heels. But with my body, I could wear only flat shoes. To walk confidently in red high heels. That was my dream, a dream I could never fulfill. Some of you may be thinking about marriage in the future. Some of you may already be married, with children of your own. As for me, I never married. There was a time when I wanted to, but I worried about my disability, and back then, discrimination against survivors marrying was still very strong. I felt uncertain and afraid. Not marrying was my own decision. Even so, when I saw people of my generation with their children, there were times when my heart ached deeply. We survivors have carried our suffering and our pain inside us, and yet we have continued to give testimony across Japan and throughout the world, appealing, "Please, do not let our suffering be repeated." In 2024, our national organization, the Japan Confederation of A and H bomb sufferers organizations, known as Nihon Hidankyo, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And still, wars rage on around the world. Children the same age I was back then are being wounded and killed. I do not want to see any more wars. And I long for the abolition of nuclear weapons. That is the most important thing.
辛かったことって
やっぱりね
何ですか？
私がやけども何もしてないでしょ。それでやっぱりこの原爆症として認められるまでに結構年数もかかりましたけど、私がやけども何もしてないもんだから、私が認定が取れてからあんたやっぱり被爆者やったとねって言われたことがあるんですよ。それがやっぱりやけども何もないから、やっぱり普通のなんていうかね、小児麻痺だっていうふうに思われて、それがやっぱり一番つらかったです。ひょっとしたらもし被爆してなかったら結婚もできて子供が2人か3人かいるかいて、まあ家庭はどうなるか分かんないけども明るい家庭が築かれたんじゃないかなって思いました。
戦争とかですね、核兵器について今
やっぱり核兵器の廃絶、それが一番です。そういって本当もう二度と再び広島長崎のような被害をどこの国の人たちにも味わわせたくないです。いやもうこの苦しみっていうのはもう実際受けた人じゃないとわからないんですよ。ね、あんたかわいそうかね、どうねって言われても、もう言われた時ははいありがとうございますって言うけど、もうなんていうか、もう絶対誰にも味わわせたくない。それが一番です。
思います。
やっぱりどこの国の人たちにももう二度と再びそれこそ広島長崎のようなあれを味わわせたくない、だから本当もう戦争ね起こしてもらいたくないですね。